if you are on the East Coast of the United States, New York City or Maine, perhaps, or if you are in Europe, let's say in Copenhagen, good evening, or Berlin, good evening, or South Africa or Algeria, or all places in that part of the world, good evening, good overnight to people further east. And good morning if you're just waking up and watching Fred Plotkin on Fridays. That makes me Fred Plotkin. And we are on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. I have a wonderful guest today. I don't get to see her much, but I think the world of her. She's really one of a kind. When we talk about supporting artists, I can think of no one who does it in a more innovative and fascinating way daily for the past 15 years than Beth Morrison, who is the founder of Beth Morrison Projects. I would say that Beth Morrison is a brand, except that I wouldn't want to have a brand. Do you want to have a brand or no?
Yeah, I'm into the brand.
Okay, well, tell me why you're into the brand.
Let me first say thank you for having me, Fred. It's always a joy to spend time with you, and I admire you so much. So thank you so much for having me. And hello to everybody who's tuning in. I am tuning in from Copenhagen, and I'll just share that I'm in the canteen of the opera house, and it's too dark outside to be able to see, but it's surrounded by windows and you just see the incredible sky and the river, and it's very, very beautiful space. So to answer your question, why the brand? I've always been into making sure that people have an aesthetic choice, an aesthetic preference to how they go about the world. And BMP certainly has a very clear aesthetic. And I think that having that clear aesthetic allows people to understand me, the production company, the artists that we work with, and it gives a cohesion to something. I mean, a lot of people say, even though our projects are completely different one to the next, that they see the brand, if you will, and they understand what it is. And so, I'm happy for that. I'm happy for that, actually.
So I'm going to ask you in a moment to define that brand, but I want to put you in the context that I see you in for our listeners. Okay. I'm not sure when we first met, but I was aware of your work well before we met. And you began in 2006 in Brooklyn. If I remember correctly, you're from Maine, the beautiful state of Maine. And Brooklyn now is a brand practically unto itself. It's trendy. It's, the French say, ça c'est très Brooklyn, meaning something is very edgy and contemporary. I was born in Manhattan, but spent my first 10 years of life in Brooklyn, not too far from a lot of the places where you have presented your projects. And it was always very left-wing, very progressive, very edgy from that point of view, but it was also wonderfully ethnic and diverse and interracial, biracial at a time when races elsewhere were separated. It was a bit of a paradise for creative people, but it also, we had people who talk like this who wanted nothing at all to do with the arts. They understood it. You had Barbara Streisand who talked like that until she began to speak like this. Mae West, Susan Hayward, Mary Tyler Moore, all kinds of great creative people. Norman Mailer came out of Brooklyn. And therefore, it is a place that has always been a home to culture. Edgar Allan Poe, I believe, wrote there for a while. I'm suddenly blocking his name, America's great poet, Leaves of Grass.
Walt Whitman.
Walt Whitman, thank you, lived and produced a lot in Brooklyn. So I don't want people to think of it as sort of Brooklyn, whatever they think of it. It has always had and openness to culture. And I think my opinion is part of it is that Brooklyn historically is Dutch. It was not British. In fact, the first battle of the Revolutionary War in the United States was fought in Brooklyn, not in Massachusetts. And the Dutch tradition of New York City, but especially Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan, means an openness and a tolerance to art and culture and religion and diversity that was not necessarily what the British brought to the new continent, the continent new to them. And so for that reason, I think it's in the water, in the dirty, filthy Brooklyn water, and in our DNA that we have this kind of feisty independence and willingness to create. So with that in mind, did you plant your roots in Brooklyn for that reason when you came from Maine?
No, and I have to say, I actually started on the Upper East Side,
Well,
and then moved to Brooklyn about, the company moved to Brooklyn about 6 years ago. Sorry for the overhead noise, but I'm in the theater, so lots of
you're in an opera house. It's
announcements.
terrific.
But I always produced in Brooklyn from the beginning. So I was really lucky that in my first year, I had an incredible show at BAM, and that kind of set my course in a way, if you will. And the Brooklyn organizations have played such an enormous part of our story, whether that is St. Anne's, whether that is BAM, whether that is Brick, Irondale. We've produced in so many incredible spaces in Brooklyn, and so that has always been a part of BMP's DNA. And I think that is, as you say, because Brooklyn, from its roots, as you just described it so well, has a different brand, if you will, than Manhattan. And that brand is a little bit freer, a little bit more ambitious, a little bit more adventurous, and more leading on the cutting edge of projects. And I think BAM certainly is the beacon, but all of the places I mentioned, as well as Roulette, we've done so many projects at Roulette, have all been part of that zeitgeist. And I think since, I started the company 16 years ago actually, Brooklyn has seen its star rise, not because of me, but its star has risen, and Brooklyn is a brand all over the world, quite apart from Manhattan. Now, when I moved to New York, I grew up in Maine, as you said. I moved from New Haven, where I was finishing up a program at Yale. But as a child in Maine, I was an actor, and all I wanted to do was be on Broadway and live in New York City. And New York City to me was Manhattan. So when I moved, there was no doubt I was not moving to Brooklyn. I was moving to Manhattan. And I had 10 really wonderful years on the Upper East Side, and then moved to Brooklyn. And the business still remains in Brooklyn now.
For people who are not from the Northeast of the United States, they may not know that in addition to the Broadway theater, there, at least since the 1920s, has been a huge amount of what we call regional theater, summer stock, all over basically parts of New Jersey, but especially in New England, the 6 states that comprise New England: Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And many actors would, when they're developing projects, or playwrights, would go to one of these theaters in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, and Maine, especially, to develop their work. Trinity Theater in Providence, Rhode Island. And I had an assistant. I'm very proud of her, because it's nice to develop people for a number of years, who is now the production manager of the Algonquin Playhouse in Maine. And where in Maine did you grow up, and what theaters were you at as a child that you were raised in theater, so to speak.
Yeah, well, so I know the Algonquin Playhouse very well. I have seen a number of shows there. I grew up in Auburn, Maine, which is the third largest city in Maine, all of about 25,000 people. Um, I grew up there in the community little theater. And so it was an amateur theater. I did do summer stock in some of the other theaters in Maine, USM Gorham I did, and some others as well. But primarily I was at the community theater in Auburn, Maine. And, you know, I was the big fish in the little pond at that time, and it was lovely. I had some wonderful roles. And then we also had a sort of spin-off group from that was called the All Student Theater Project. And it was a very entrepreneurial group of theater makers in their teens and 20s. And we would come together over the Christmas holiday break for universities. And we would spend 3 weeks really like working around the clock to put up a show. So we did I was Evita in Evita. We did, I music directed Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods. We did Hair. That was one of my favorite projects that we did. You know, and it was honestly like the best theater in Maine. We just had these incredibly high level people, students that were doing it, and it was all heart. You know, we all were painting the sets and, you know, darning the costumes, and, you know, we did everything. But it was very DIY and super in my, like, got into my blood, that was what I wanted to do.
For non-English listeners, DIY means do it yourself. What did you study at Yale?
So I did an MFA in theater management and producing at the Yale School of Drama, now the David Geffen School of Drama. Yeah. And before that, I did a Master of Music in Vocal Performance and Vocal Pedagogy at Arizona State. And then before that, I did a Bachelor of Music in Vocal Performance at Boston University.
So now I'm getting a fuller picture of how you arrived to where you are now. But I wonder, you are much younger, whether you ever heard of, came across a woman named Jane Herman. Jane Herman, I'm going to tell her age. I hope she's not watching and doesn't mind, but she's 86.
I don't think so.
And Jane Herman was a mentor to me. And she was sort of the Beth Morrison of her era. And at a time when most of the impresarios were men, Jane was known as the impresaria assoluta, the absolute impresario, because of her brilliance at creating shows, productions, presentations, all across the artistic spectrum, and not just simply grand opera, traditional ballet, that in almost every case sold out, that people doubted what Jane would do. And then when she would do it, people would say, well, of course, why didn't I think of that? And my answer always was, well, you're not Jane Herman. And Jane, because of the time when she grew up in, had to really have sharp elbows. And some people thought that she was not easy. I adored her because I learned so much from her. And she, when she would deal with the challenges of production, deal with contract issues that couldn't work, deal with the State Department when an artist from the Soviet Union couldn't come over, all of that. She'd curse a lot, really a lot, which sort of scared people away, but I didn't mind. But she said to me, whenever you wonder whether you got into the right business, whenever you find it too hard, get up out of your chair, walk into the auditorium, in this case, the Metropolitan Opera House, sit down. If they're rehearsing something, just watch. If they're not, if you're in an empty space, even if there's just the ghost light, the light that they put on the stage when nothing is happening, just sit there. Let it wash over you. Your priorities will be reordered, and you'll understand why you do what you do. And that, plus teaching me how to negotiate the best contract one could possibly negotiate, in that it's good for the company and good for the artist. So no one is being ripped off. she instilled all of these values in me and taught me curse words I'd never heard before. I used to get ear infections from the language, but it was okay. Um, I'll try to introduce you to Jane. She's
I would
really
love
quite
that. She
something.
sounds incredible. Yeah, I would
She's
love
one
to
of
meet.
my heroes and icons in my career. And you know, I'm now of the age where I'm passing on to younger people things that I've learned because, you know, I talk about artists I've heard, worked with, like Joan Sutherland, and that seems like ancient history. I worked with Joan Sutherland a lot, and she lived in Brooklyn, by the way. Did you know that? She
I
lived
actually did not know that.
she
No.
lived on just opposite Prospect Park. She lived in a beautiful mansion with a friend of hers and her husband, and it was a nice situation. And she loved every night leaving the Metropolitan Opera House and getting either on the subway or a car if it was winter, and going home to Brooklyn and walking in Prospect Park. So it's important that we document all this stuff. And frankly, that's part of why I do Fred Plotkin on Fridays, to document the older stuff, but also I really want people of your generation to see you, because I see you, as I said, as not the same as Jane Herman because you're working with different art, but the spirit of Jane Herman. And
Thank you.
she and you do great things. And I always know that when I
Thank
go to a
you.
Beth Morrison project, that it will be serious, it will be high quality. It may not necessarily strike chords in me. Some did phenomenally, some did less so, but I always know that I'm going for something serious, but serious in a pleasing way. And this gets back to the notion of the brand. I suppose that I try to resist words like brand because I find it confining, but clearly you have a different view. And I'd love to know more about that because
Sure.
the producer, have an audience and a following. And that, frankly, in modern times is very unusual. It was in the past, Saul Hurek, when David Belasco, people, Jane Herman, people in the past, you went to see their presentations because they're Florence Ziegfeld, because they were doing it. And frankly, right now, yes, there's the Public Theater in New York, and there are theaters directed by wonderful people, Oscar Eustis in the case of the Public Theater, the National Theater in London, in Copenhagen, where you are, there are wonderful theaters everywhere, Vienna. But there are not too many people where the producer is the brand rather than the artist or the name of the building. So clearly, it was a combination of your conscious effort to do that, plus the fact that you've accumulated stellar work. So that's not my opinion. I'm knowledgeable about this stuff. You have produced stellar work. You don't have to say thank you. I say thank you to you because you've done it. So,
well,
brand.
I mean, so I think maybe the best quote that I've gotten in major press is an Opera News quote that says Beth Morrison is her own genre, and that to me was amazing because it speaks to brand. It's like when I set out to start Beth Morrison Projects, I actually set out to change the opera industry. Like that was the reason I formed BMP. And I know that sounds like I have massive hubris and I must be an egomaniac, but honestly, I saw something that was possible because I went to theater and I loved theater that just wasn't happening in opera. And I wanted to bring that aesthetic, that sort of experimental aesthetic, that avant-garde aesthetic. And of course, like there are productions in Europe that are, doing this, but they're not doing new work. And so the other thing that I was interested in was creating a body of work that was relevant to a contemporary audience, to people my age, to people younger than me, and that I wanted to make the art form feel relevant and necessary and important to a generation that didn't grow up with even music education. Forget like, grand opera. And so, I was just lit up to try to achieve this. And I also kind of, as I went on, I wanted to create like a black box opera movement. In fact, I wrote like
Describe
this
black
manifesto.
box for those who don't know.
Yeah, so black box is a smaller theater. It's a flexible space. You can put the seats in, you can take the seats out, but it is a sort of a neutral room that is generally painted black, which is why it gets its name. And it's for much more intimate theatrical experiences than, say like the Metropolitan Opera or any large theater. And so I think like 10 years ago, I wrote this manifesto and I could not get it published at that time, but it was, I did send it to, I think I sent it to Opera America or whatever. Anyway, it was like a manifesto on why opera should create a black box movement. And right around that time, it started my festival Prototype, which is now going into its anniversary 10th season. And that festival originally started as a black box opera festival. Now, as I've grown, BMP's grown, the projects have grown, like we've expanded out to much larger theaters, but we always have black box opera as part of what we're doing. So working for the Institute, like opera in Boston, and
so Beth,
was just
you froze
just
a bit.
not feeling
Beth,
fulfilled by it. Inspired.
You froze a bit. The internet froze.
Oh.
I'm going to ask you just to repeat the last
Sorry.
two sentences.
Can you hear me?
Yes. After you said black box opera movement.
Yeah. Hopefully it won't happen
and
again.
Prototype.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So Prototype is my festival that we started 10 years ago. I co-produced that with Here Art Center, which is a space in Soho that has 2 black boxes. And so the reason for the festival was because in January, there are these amazing industry conferences that happen. And they bring venue directors from all over the world into New York City, and they're looking for work to bring back to their theaters. There was no festival that I could get my work into. They were all theater, jazz, world music, but nothing for chamber opera. And so I decided that, I was frustrated and I wanted to start my own festival, and we got the backing of the Andrew Mellon Foundation to help us start the festival. They're still our largest supporter. And, through the festival, we started, really bringing black box opera into the sort of zeitgeist. And, I remember the first review of it was Mohammed Farouz's piece that we started the festival with, and Anthony Tomasini was there. And he wrote in his review how incredible it was to be in a black box watching opera, because you're so intimate with the performers. You're like right on top of them, like you feel like you're in it. And that was like kind of the beginning of the movement. And so through that platform, and then obviously through the other work that we were doing, we started to get this sort of interest in this kind of work over time. And BMP, was a leader in that, but now, there's so many companies that now are doing black box opera, small scale pieces. If they're, they have their main stage and then a smaller stage, which is what theater's been doing for years and was trying to get opera to get into. And so it happened. So that's like, I think if there's any legacy that I leave this earth on when I decide to depart, I hope that that's it,
Don't go. What you said raises a few topics. One is, I want listeners to know that you've produced more than 50 works that have been seen in 14 countries.
Yeah.
And we are, in fact, speaking to you in Denmark, where you're working on a work that we'll talk about in a bit. And Anthony Tomasini is the chief classical music critic for the New York Times. Was it Sumaida's Song? Was that the opera by Fairuz?
Yeah.
Yes, it
Yeah.
was wonderful.
Yeah, that was the first
And I
one.
remember that's when I
Yeah.
kind of noticed you too. And I had heard of you before, but I think that may have been the first Beth Morrison work I'd been to. I think it's also very important that listeners know that the Prototype Festival is really the first opera festival of the year. And
Yeah.
I think you were very smart to make it in early January. People said to me, is she crazy in the middle of winter when the weather is awful? Frankly, we in New York hunger and thirst for things all the year. And it's the perfect niche. And yes, there are conferences, I've spoken at some of them, in which all of these producers and directors and casting people come in from around the world. And they're there in January and they go to Broadway shows, but then the smart ones also go to the Prototype Festival. And I have some friends who always, when they're in New York, go to everything you present. I would like to say that I've seen many works there. One of them from 2017, I think is just one of the greatest contemporary operas. It's called Breaking the Waves.
Breaking the Waves.
By Missy Mazzoli and Royce Favreck. It was stunning. And as you know, I write for WQXR. I'm an opera writer. I'm not a critic. And every year I sort of name the best of the year. I don't review, and it's not like the Oscars where there are nominees and winners. I just, the ones that really grabbed me, and they're called the Freddie Awards. And Breaking the Waves got the Freddie Award and got Best Female Singer. And it was that stunning. Would you talk about how that opera came to be and where it's gone since it was produced by you in Opera Philadelphia?
Sure. So Missy Mazzoli, the composer, she and I did her first opera together, Song from the Uproar, which we did in 2012 at the Kitchen. It's still one of my absolute favorite scores that's ever been written by anybody. I absolutely love it. And Breaking the Waves was the follow-up piece to Song from the Uproar. Missy had been, she had been chosen as one of Opera Philadelphia's composers in residence. And they started talking to her about what opera they would want, she would want to do. And Royce always wanted to do, who also did Song from the Uproar, Royce always wanted to do an adaptation of Lars von Trier's Breaking the Waves. And Opera Philadelphia was game for it. They reached out to me, through Missy and Royce and said, you've been Missy's producer. We've done so many things together. We'd love to have you on board with her second opera, which I said, of course, yes, immediately. And so we co-commissioned the work together, and it was developed over a series of years. And then Opera Philadelphia premiered the piece in their festival, the first year of their O Festival, which, by the way, and he will say, David Devan, the director of Philadelphia, will say, they modeled the O Festival after Prototype. So that was a really sort of proud moment for me to hear that from a company like that. Sorry, stage manager.
That's fine.
And so then after it had premiered in the O Festival, we decided that we would also do a New York City premiere of it in our Prototype Festival, as you said, in 2017. It was absolutely one of the hits of the entire 10-year history of the festival. It's an astonishing work, both musically and dramatically. Keira Duffy was the star. She was Bess. John Moore was her Jan as the other star of the show. They were unbelievable. I get chills just thinking about how astonishing they were. The piece has gone on in other productions in Scotland, in Houston. It was supposed to be with LA Opera, but they did it digitally instead because of Prototype. Because of pandemic. Pandemic. And it will have a much longer life. It's also just had a production in Norway this month. So it's going far and wide, and we'll have many, many productions. I think it's entered the repertoire, quite frankly.
I think it's interesting, sorry to interrupt, to hear that it played in Scotland and Norway, because it's set on and near an oil rig in the North Sea,
in Scotland,
in the oil industry in Scotland, but basically it's the other side is Norway. How did local audiences respond to the narrative? Yes, it's based on a film by Lars von Trier, but opera is a very different form from cinema. And how did they react to this rather grim, compelling operatic story?
I mean, the press has been extraordinary all over the world, wherever it's gone. And it's undeniable. It really is. It's an undeniable opera. You can't see it and not think that it is extraordinary. Even if you don't like it, you can see the high level of the craft, the high level of the storytelling. It's an undeniable, incredible piece.
So then when you work with artists like Misty Mazzoli and Royce Fabric, do you then think, I want to work with them again? How does that work with Impresaria Assoluta, with your impresario's hat on?
Yeah.
What do you then say to them?
BMP is really, I have to say, Fred, this is one of the biggest challenges for me, is balancing the fact that BMP is known for identifying young talent, nurturing it, and then sort of sending it off to the big leagues. We did that with Nico Muhly. He was the first composer that I ever produced. We did a number of pieces together. Then Misty Mazzoli, then David T. Little, all three of whom now are commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera. And so, Paolo Prestini, Ted Hearn, they're these composers who are at the core, at the heart of who BMP is and has been. And wanting to continue working with them over time is very important to me. But identifying the young talent coming up is truly what I think BMP is on this planet to do. And so that balance is a very difficult one. I will say that, obviously, like Missy, Nico, David, they're being produced by the Metropolitan Opera. They don't need me anymore. But what I give to them is the opportunity to do the experimental works that no one else would do, that a large opera company wouldn't do. And so, for instance, David Little's piece, Black Lodge, which is a quirky little strange music theater project that we had been developing for 10 years, and we were going to premiere it on the stage. We decided to make a film.
I know. Comes out next year or the year after, right? Yeah.
We're doing a screening of it in 2 weeks. So you should have gotten an invitation from Andrew Ousley to come to that. And if not, I will follow up with him. But yes, we're doing a screening. It's finished. The film is done. We had an unbelievable time doing it. And I can talk more about that later, but just to say, like, that's what I can give to the composers who are, now the leaders of their generation. I can give them I can do their projects that are the weird ones, if you will. Those are the ones I want to do, because those are the ones that inevitably are changing the form, expanding the boundaries of what the form can be. And they're also my best friends. It's like we sort of fall in love with each other when you do this work, particularly at a very early age together, when it was like, none of us knew how anything was ever going to happen, and we just like figured it out together and just made it happen together. And so those bonds with those composers are very, very, very tight, and they're some of my very closest friends. And then now, my great joy is through our Next Gen program, which is essentially a composers competition. It's meant to identify young composers who are either in school or just out of school. And through a series of years, we commission the works over time. So this year we just had Nilofar Norbach and Elizabeth Bartman win the first round. We had 117 submissions, 10 finalists. We presented them at Sawdust over, over the internet. And then the two of them won. We're commissioning the two of them now to write 30-minute operas, which we'll present next year, or actually this season in the spring. And then from there, I'll choose one of them and we'll commission an evening length opera from them. And we'll develop that over a period of 3 to 4 years. And so the first cycle winner, Emma O'Halloran, is having her full evening length opera presented in prototype this year. It's a piece called Trade. And she's extraordinary, and she will be the next incredible composer coming out of BMP. We're really lucky, like Ellen Reed and Duyun, who are two core artists of our company, both won Pulitzer Prizes for the operas that we commissioned and developed for them. Ellen Reed's Prism and Duyun's Angel's Bone. And I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of is has the Met commissioned any Pulitzer Prize winning operas? Not yet. So I feel like, hey, that's pretty good.
So again, this leads to a lot of questions. The first question is, before creating the competition, how did you identify young talent? Where did you find them? And then what light bulb had to go on for you to say, this is the person with talent who I want to engage for work?
Well, I'll take the second question first, which is, how do I choose the composers that we want to work with? For me, it comes down to them having a singular voice. So Missy's a great example. Okay, so I love it when I can hear like the forefathers and foremothers of their lineage, right? So with Missy, that's Reich and Adams and Glass and Benjamin Britten. And you can hear all of that in Missy, but then Missy has her own very strong, very unique, very incredible, dramatic voice of her own. And she understands how to write drama and theater. And those are the two things I look for. Can they write theater? Is their music inherently theatrical, dramatic? And can I hear only themselves? Well, can I hear their forefathers and foremothers, but are they only uniquely themselves? And do they sound like nobody else but themselves? And so those are the two things that I prize the most. And the other stuff can be learned. If they haven't written much for the voice, they can learn how to write for the voice. Like I can help them with that. I can help them with all of the things about understanding, dramatic structure and all those kinds of things. I can put dramaturgs with them. I can put the right director for them. Like that's my job as a producer, is to help them to learn those things by surrounding them with the artists that can help them grow in those ways. And that's my great pleasure. So that's the second part of your question. Now I can't even remember the first question. What was the first question?
That's okay. I'm going to go to another.
No. I remember.
How do you identify?
No, how did I find them?
Yeah.
That's how I identify them. But then how did I identify them in the early stages?
Right.
And so what I did was I just went to everything I could possibly go.
So I'm speaking because Beth seems to have paused. The Danish Wi-Fi has frozen her. I don't know if she hears me, but maybe yes, maybe no. Let's see what happens. There she is.
Back?
So there you are. You're back. You went. You were saying you went
that.
to everything you could possibly go to.
I went to everything I could possibly go to, in small venues, small clubs, small churches where new music scene was happening with the younger generation. It wasn't at Lincoln Center. It wasn't at the big places. It was all the small places. And through just listening to so many different composers and young artists, I started to form my aesthetic. I started to understand who the composers were that I felt we had a commonality of language of what we were trying to do. I also happened to, very fortunately enter the New York scene with these other, young artists. And the composers typically, they typically don't write opera until much later in their careers. But this generation wanted to write opera immediately. They were interested in telling stories, and they didn't have somebody to produce those stories. So we had this synergy together. And then once you start meeting one person, then you meet 10 more just because you met that one person. So, Missy, I've actually known Missy for a very long time, well before we moved to New York. We were at Yale together, we were at the Tanglewood Institute together. So we've known each other, we were at Boston University together. We've known each other a very long time. But through her, I met David T. Little and Judd Greenstein. They had formed a little collective at that time. And Missy was like, we want to have you do this opera. And I was like, great. Where is it? Let me hear it. And they're like, oh, well, we haven't written it yet. I was like, well, at that time I couldn't commission because I didn't have any money. So it was like, okay, well, when it's written, let me know and I'm happy to do it. Well, that never happened. But David Little called me the next day and was like, I need you to hear Soldier Songs. And Soldier Songs basically started everything. Honestly, like that piece is like a core piece. Still, we tour it today. And it's now totally in the repertoire. Regional opera companies are doing it all over. And it's become, a core part of the repertoire now. So that's sort of a little bit of how it started.
So Beth Morrison Projects began in 2006. On August 1st of that year, Peter Gelb became general manager of the Metropolitan Opera. So he's been there a long time, and eventually he will step down, as all general managers do. They've never had a woman run the company. Would you want to run the Metropolitan Opera?
Well, I don't know. I think the Metropolitan Opera comes with a lot of struggles, and I don't know.
I'm not saying that to put you on the spot, but just because I want listeners to understand that there's all kinds of opera, and I don't put one opera here and another opera there. To me, it's all opera. I call it planet opera is my term. And you and I live on Planet Opera.
We live on
and the
Planet
Met
Opera.
is on Planet Opera, and Beth Morrison Projects is on Planet Opera, and all kinds of wonderful things. It's in addition a way of saying that many Europeans say to me, oh, there's no opera in America. And I push back on that because I would argue that
That's
more
crazy.
than Germany, more than other places, America right now is the place that's producing the most interesting new opera.
Absolutely.
And you're a big part of it. You're not the only one, but you're a big part of it.
Thank you.
The Danish Wi-Fi is going out again. So
I think I'm frozen about.
There you go. So after you said thank you, I don't know what you said.
I'm sorry. No, I said, I think that the Europeans are actually envious of America because we do so much new work. And when I talk to directors and composers over here, there's a bit of a frustration. They do incredible productions of repertoire. Things I'm really into, very experimental work, but it doesn't translate over to this extraordinary body of work that has been created in America since 2000, 2002, whatever. And just so much incredible work has come out of this century. I think Americans should be extremely proud of what's happening in opera in America. It's, as far as I'm concerned, it's by far the most interesting.
And I think, unfortunately, most of our citizens have no clue about that. And again, I'm not being a Republican or a Democrat here, because I know many Republicans who secretly confess that they love opera, but they just don't say it publicly. And whereas certain kinds of opera, certainly what you produce in a liberal place like Brooklyn, get with them the attached sense that they're breaking the waves, frankly, to use that term again, that they're edgy, that they are things that we don't like. I always point out that Rigoletto is about incest and Traviata is about prostitution, and Di Valcura is about incest, and Le Nozze di Figaro is about all kinds of sleeping around with everybody else and whatever you want to do, and cross-dressing, to use an older term. And it was all there back then. Monteverdi at the very beginning had all of these political and sexual elements. Opera is that, and that's part of, frankly, what I love about opera. And you are just continuing that tradition. Now, a question that I'm sure you were asked, and I'm going to ask it now, is it's great to have the artistic taste and sensibility that you have, but there have been many people who have attempted to do what you do, including other companies in Brooklyn, that have failed financially. And where you told me you studied artist management at Yale, which is great, but still you need more than that, than studying it in a university. Where did you acquire the business side? That's what Jane Herman had too. Her shows made money, but you're the only other person, and it's not male or female, it's the only other person I've come across who has a very high record of paying forward and remaining solvent. And yes, you mentioned the Mellon Foundation and grants and so on, but you also said at the very beginning that you didn't have the money to pay Missy for an opera. How do you run the financial side?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I will say, when I started, I come from, middle class roots in Maine. I don't come from money. I didn't know anybody when I came to New York. So I literally started with zero, in the bank account for BMP. I credit a couple of things. One, I'm artistically risky, but financially cautious. I always have been. I actually didn't pay myself for 6 years from the company. I was supporting myself as a voice teacher. And every dollar I was raising, I was just putting onto the stage. And, it was really tough at the beginning. Nobody knew me. I was trying to make a name. I didn't have any supporters. And it was really very challenging for the first 4 or 5 years. After that, I started to get a lot of press. And once the press started, then foundations are interested in you. Individual supporters are interested in you. Presenters are interested in you. So things changed then. But I will say that my business model is fundamentally different than the business model of most opera companies, if you will. So what I learned at Yale was the nonprofit theater model. And what I also learned during that time, I did a fellowship with Pomegranate Arts, which is a wonderful company that's headed up by Linda Brumbach. She tours Philip Glass and Laurie Anderson and a bunch of really incredible artists. And from her, I learned how to be a touring producer. And so I put together the nonprofit model with the touring model. And the touring model is essentially a for-profit model, if you will. And so I'm able to raise money through foundations because my company is a nonprofit, a 501c3. I'm able to take donations and all of those kinds of things. But our business model is predicated on working with presenters. So the presenters are essentially earned income stream for us, and they will pay, whatever it costs them to do 1 week of performances in their venue. And so basically how it works is BMP will fundraise for the production, but we don't have to pay for a theater. We don't have to pay for the labor. We don't have stage labor. We don't have to pay for marketing. We don't have to pay for box office. And so all of those costs, which can be hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs, are shouldered by our presenting partner. And BMP is shouldering the cost of the artists, the fees for the artists, the sets, the costumes, all of the media, all of the things. And so that shared model, if you will, has allowed us to do way more work than we would have been able to do had we just taken all those costs on ourselves and rented the theater and done all those things. Now, there are pluses and minuses to everything, right? One of the minuses is when you go to BAM and you see a BMP show, very often the audience will walk out saying, man, that show was an amazing BAM show. And we just sort of get missed. And sometimes we get missed in reviews. That's the downside. The upside is we've always been able to do a lot of work because of this model. So typically BMP is doing 3 to 5 world premieres. Typically we are doing at least 5 tours a year and 3 to 5 developmental workshops. That's an enormous amount of work. And it's a huge amount of work. And we're finally growing infrastructurally now to support it. So when I started, it was just me. 6 years in, I got my first assistant. 2 years after that, I got my general manager, Jecca Berry. And things really changed when I got Jecca, partly because she is a financial wizard. And she is the one that really forecasts everything now for us, which is unbelievable. And we strategically think through everything together for the company. She's now the executive director. And we're now 14 people that make up the BMP staff. And so we've grown tremendously over the years and feel now that I'm finally, for the first time, at a space and a place where we have the
Whoop, lost the Wi-Fi again. I'm at a space where we have let's see what happens. Danish Wi-Fi. I love Danish modern furniture. I love Danish food. I love Denmark as a country, but their Wi-Fi is a little spotty tonight. Okay, there we go.
Well, bad. Yeah, there I am. So so we have 14 people in our staff now, and we're finally at the place where we have the infrastructure needed to do the amount of work that we're doing.
So again, if I remember it, I could be wrong. Jack is from Chicago or lived in Chicago, and
she's not. Jack is actually from England and from Washington D.C. and from Washington D.C., but has been living in New York for the last 15 years.
I don't know why I associated her with Chicago, but I mentioned Chicago also because I realized in talking to you that my 2 biggest mentors in America were women. In Europe, they were men. Amazing. It was Georgia Strehler and a couple of others. But in America, it was Jane Herman and Artis Kranick, who was the impresaria assoluta, the head of the Lyric Opera of Chicago for many years. And she taught me financial probity and how to really read contracts well and be fair to the artist, but also protect the company. But she had a policy of what she called 75-25. She would produce 8 operas a year. And she expected that 6 of the 8, 75%, would be Traviata and Tannhäuser and The Marriage of Figaro and the traditional works, Madame Butterfly. But the other 2, one of them would be a rare work from the old repertory. So let's say something by Umberto Giordano. And then the other would be a new opera. Because in the 80s, 90s, no one commissioned more new works in America than Artis Kranick and the Lyric. And she counted on the fact that the company would make its money from the 6 operas, the 75%, and that the other 2, if they earn money, good. But the goal was otherwise, was artistic diversity. It was promoting younger composers or even more established composers who we wanted to do opera from them. And the model worked very well for a very long time. Yes, the 80s in Chicago were pretty rich and they got a lot of funding and she was a marvelous fundraiser. But she too understood that you cannot just do the old stuff, although I adore the old stuff. But part of opera, it had to be a living, breathing thing. And even in an institution as solid and traditional, let's say, as the Lyric Opera of Chicago. She opened the door to the new. And that's what I love seeing with you. When you mentioned just now how many works you produce in a year, that's the same as the Lyric Opera of Chicago. And that's more than many American opera companies. But it's important and fascinating what you say about the touring model. Jane Herman did that, where she would create things that would tour, or she would import it to the Metropolitan Opera House, such as having Yves Montand come sing at the Met, or having the Finnish National Opera, or the Dutch National Ballet, or the Royal Danish Ballet, speaking of Denmark. And she understood the bottom line. Did you ever do any kind of, quote, business school training? I know I have colleagues who are managers of companies who there's a sort of seminar at Harvard that's done for arts managers very specifically to learn that. I know you studied at Yale, but
yeah, no, the only thing I did was the theater management program at Yale, but there was accounting as part of that. There was production budgeting as part of that. Like, I learned those skills there for sure.
So now let's talk, because I know you're in rehearsal right now. We just have about 5 more minutes. What are you doing now in Denmark? At that wonderful theater, by the way. I've worked in that theater. It's a magnificent Danish modern theater with the most beautiful plates and bowls and spoons in the restaurant, and Danish comfortable chairs and beautiful wood. It's gorgeous. Talk about it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful space. It's a beautiful city. We are doing the world premiere of a piece called Book of Mountains and Seas by the Chinese composer Huang Ro. And the production is by Basil Twist, who is the American puppeteer, master puppeteer, if you will. And it's a very much an international collaboration. The co-producers on the project are Snova of Copenhagen, which is their performers as well. They're a 12-person choir headed up by Paul Hillier, the conductor. And it's also, the other commissioners are Hong Kong New Visions Festival, the Amsterdam Core Biennale, and a wonderful company in Canada as well. So we've got this incredible group of international producers, and we've been working on this for 4 years. It predates the pandemic, but it's a beautiful adaptation of an ancient Chinese text called the Book of Mountains and Seas. And it's basically about our relationship as humans to the planet. And it's incredible how it resonates today, and all of the issues that we're having around climate change and all these different things. It's an abstract piece. There's not like a linear narrative to it. There are also 6 puppeteers who are doing these sort of gorgeous, incredible stage pictures with, creating. Basil, of course, uses silks and all these different kinds of lanterns, and driftwood is playing a huge part in the design, as the puppeteers create out of the driftwood a dragon, as they create a giant called Kwa Fu, who is chasing the sun. And it's a spectacular piece. It's a very complex score. He's written 12 single individual lines, so every singer is singing their own line, which typically singers are, if you have a choir of 12, typically you're 3 on a part, but this is 1 on a part for the 12 stems. So it's taken a lot out of the choir to learn it, and they've done really well. And we premiere on Wednesday night,
coinciding with the climate conference in Glasgow.
I didn't even think about it, but you're absolutely right.
Yes.
You're absolutely right.
Have you, the press department at the Royal Danish Opera, they're nice people, I know them. Link that, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Coinciding with the international conference in Glasgow.
Such a good idea.
And it's interesting, by the way, that President Xi of China is not going to the conference, and this is a Chinese story. And I think that's
Exactly.
another thing to tease out. Not that I need to tell you how to promote an opera, but
I
I'm
take all
giving
advice, Fred.
my friendly input.
Take all your advice.
I have learned a long time ago when I began in this business that we have to stick to the clock. And you gave me 15 more seconds. So Beth Morrison Projects, prototypefestival.org, January 7th to 16th of 2022. You are the future of opera. And I'm so glad to know you. And I thank you for everything you do.
Thank you, Fred. It's a joy and a pleasure to spend time with you.
See you soon back in New York in January for the Prototype Festival.
In January, I'm counting on it.
Okay, take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.